evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight, happy Monday, trying to stay cheerful in the face of everything that's happening to the country. We talk about it every night, multiple disasters all at once. But if you had to isolate one single tragedy that's produced the highest casualty rate in the United States, it would probably have to be the opioid crisis. Over the past 25 years, opioids have destroyed entire regions of the country, mostly rural areas, places populated by the people who built and fed this country for generations. Hundreds of thousands of them have died from opioids, and they're still dying. More than 100,000 drug ODs just last year, mostly from fentanyl. Fentanyl's imported from China, it's smuggled through Mexico. If you live here, you probably know someone who's died from fentanyl, probably someone's child. What you may have forgotten in the face of all this sadness is that the opioid epidemic was not organic. It didn't just happen one day because people in sparsely populated zip codes in Kentucky and Vermont and West Virginia suddenly felt sad and started taking dangerous drugs. No. This particular disaster was created by drug companies. That's true. Purdue Pharma kicked it off. They did so by aggressively marketing a narcotic called OxyContin. They sold it to doctors, and doctors sold it to their patients on the false claim it was non-addictive. It was very addictive. What happened next? Well, drive through upstate New York sometime. You can see the human carnage. Ultimately, Purdue Pharma faced a barrage of lawsuits and then criminal charges. In the end, however, not a single executive from that or any other drug company ever went to jail. So no one was ever really punished for all those deaths, hundreds of thousands of deaths. Well, for a brief moment, it seemed possible that somebody would be punished. No one remembers this, but during the Democratic primaries in 2019, Kamala Harris, of all people, described pharma executives as, quote, nothing more than some high-level dope dealers who should, quote, be held accountable. Then a few months later, she went further than that. Harris suggested the drug companies were so evil they might produce a COVID vaccine that wound up hurting people. Quote, if Donald Trump tells us we should take it, I'm not taking it, Harris said. And then other Democrats, including Andrew Cuomo, then the governor of New York, said the very same thing. But here's the amazing part. The second Joe Biden took office, talk like that stopped immediately. Never has a tune changed faster. Kamala Harris, who just months before had called drug companies dope dealers, suddenly sounded like the chief marketing officer at Pfizer. At one point, Harris announced that volunteers would go, quote, door to door to promote Pfizer's products. Never in our history have federal officials touted a publicly held company more aggressively than the Biden administration touted Pfizer. And as a result, Pfizer's stock price exploded. Its executives made billions. Gone was any suggestion that the drug companies might be capable of doing anything wrong ever. Instead, the media and the Biden administration lauded pharma executives as moral heroes. And some of their products are life-saving, that is true. But the bigger truth we are now learning is more complicated than that. In just the past few weeks, serious, very serious questions have emerged about some of the most widely prescribed drugs in America, very much including the COVID vaccines. But we want to begin tonight with what in any normal period would be front-page news around the world. It turns out the entire premise behind the most commonly prescribed antidepressant drugs appears to be completely wrong. These drugs are known as SSRIs. They're ubiquitous. Between 1991 and 2018, total SSRI prescriptions in the U.S. rose by more than 3,000%. The number of prescriptions for the most common SSRIs hit 224 million last year. 224 million prescriptions in a country of 330 million people. In other words, you know dozens of people who are taking SSRIs. You may be taking them right now. And yet for decades, there have been strong indications that there is a problem with these drugs. And the most obvious is this. Antidepressants are supposed to cure depression. That's why they're prescribed. And yet over the same period that SSRI prescriptions have risen 3,000%, the suicide rate, maybe the most reliable indicator of all of depression, has not fallen in the United States. In fact, the suicide rate has jumped by 35%. That's a huge increase. That's a lot of dead people. Now, drug makers admit that their products may be part of the reason for the increase in suicide. The makers of Prozac, for example, concede that young people who take that drug have an increased risk of suicide compared to those who took a placebo. Think about that for a second. A drug that's supposed to make you less sad may make it more likely that you will kill yourself. How is that allowed? Well, it's been allowed because virtually no one has said a word about it. One person who did say something about it a long time ago was the actor Tom Cruise. All the way back in 2005, he had a very famous appearance on the Today Show. You may remember it. Here it is.
Here we are today, where I talk out against drugs and psychiatric abuses of electric shocking people, okay, against their will, of drugging children with them not knowing the effects of these drugs. Do you know what Adderall is? Do you know Ritalin? Do you know now that Ritalin is a street drug? Do you understand that?
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem, Matt. And if you understand the history of it, it masks the problem. That's what it does. That's all it does. You're not getting to the reason why. There is no such thing as a chemical imbalance. Drugs aren't the answer. That these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs. And there are ways of doing it without that so that we don't end up in a brave new world.
So Cruz said a few things. One, maybe you shouldn't trust the pharma companies and just hand your children whatever they're producing and hope for the best. Two, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance in your brain that causes depression. He said that. And three, these drugs mask the real problems. You're suffering for a real reason that drugs can't fix. Provocative statements. How did the country respond to this? Well, everyone in the media agreed. Tom Cruise is crazy. He's in a cult. Shut up. A lot of people thought that. We may even have thought that. But then more information kept coming out that made Tom Cruise look a little less crazy. In 2015, researchers from the scientific journal BMJ found that, quote, some birth defects occur 2 to 3.5 times more frequently, a lot more frequently, among the infants of women treated with SSRIs early in pregnancy. Wow, that's a huge problem. Ignored. In the same journal in 2020, researchers found that, quote, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction is underrecognized and can be debilitating both psychologically and physically. Well, that's kind of a problem, too. If it steals your sex drive, maybe it's stealing your soul? No, ignore it. Only cult members care. Then last year, researchers in Sweden found that, quote, there may be an increased hazard of violent crime during SSRI medication in a small group of patients. It may exist across age groups and throughout treatment periods, and it possibly persists for up to 12 weeks after treatment discontinuation. So even after you stop taking the drugs, you may be impotent, infertile, violent. But at least the drugs cure the chemical imbalance in your brain that causes your depression. That was the selling point. What a great piece of marketing that was. You've got a chemical imbalance in your brain. You need these drugs. And so hundreds of millions of prescriptions every year for these drugs. Well, in what seemed like news to us, last week we learned that actually SSRIs don't cure a chemical imbalance in your brain. So the acronym SSRI stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. The theory has been for 30 years, that depressed people have an imbalance of serotonin in their brains. They have a chemical imbalance. If you give them more serotonin, then they become less depressed and happy. They're less likely to kill themselves, right? But it turns out that serotonin deficiencies are not the reason people get depressed. That's not just a guess, it's now officially science. This new finding comes from University College London. Just completed a long and huge study on the relationship between depression and serotonin. It was published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry. Here's what the lead author of that study, Joanna Moncrief, said about the findings. Quote, I think we can safely say, after a vast amount of research conducted over several decades, there is no convincing evidence that depression is caused by serotonin abnormalities, particularly by lower levels or reduced activity of serotonin. What? That was the whole premise of the drug which virtually the entire American population was taking on their doctor's advice. And by the way, the drug companies made billions off those drugs. So first we were told that SSRIs would save lives. Now we learn they don't actually work as intended. In fact, the whole idea behind the drug was completely wrong. And yet, and here's the best part, people are ignoring this news and the drugs are still being prescribed. How can that happen in a country based on science? Well, as it turns out, and this is the real point, that happens all the time. Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. We talked about this before, and we couldn't resist inviting him back on the eve of his vindication. Johann Hari, thanks so much for coming on. You've been saying for like a decade now that drugs are not the answer to depression. How do you greet this news that you were right?
Look, drugs can give some relief to some people. They gave relief to me for a while, but we've got to be really honest with people. Everyone watching knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that everyone has natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. And this culture we built is good at lots of things, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting people's deep underlying psychological needs. And that is the reason why depression has been hugely rising. And the issue I have is not so much with the drugs. The drugs give some relief. They cause some severe side effects for some people. Over time, for most people, but not everyone, the effects tend to wear off. But my issue isn't so much with the drugs. My issue is with the story we tell that accompanies the drugs, right? We're giving people an inaccurate map of their pain. When I went to my doctor and I was really depressed and I was a teenager, I was told, oh, your pain is just a malfunction in your brain, right? You're lacking serotonin. All you need to do is drug yourself. And for me personally, what I needed to figure out was, I had been severely abused when I was a child. I had a lot of work to do on processing that, on realizing that I didn't deserve to be treated that way. Actually, it was only once I did that I found my way out of depression, right? And so my issue is because I was told to distrust my brain, I was told to, everyone watching, your pain makes sense. Your depression and anxiety are not malfunctions. They are signals. They're telling us something. Now, not everyone was abused. Some people, there is scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I write about in my book, Lost Connections. And 2 of them are in our biology, although none of them are a chemical imbalance. But most of them are factors in the way we live. Think about loneliness, right? Depression and anxiety doubled in the last 2 years as we all became much lonelier. Now, that's completely common sense. Your grandma would have understood that immediately. Gee, grandma, do you think if you're really lonely, you're more likely to be depressed and anxious? We've got to return to more common sense understandings of depression and anxiety, most importantly because they lead us to the real solutions. For example, here in Britain, there was a huge program of encouraging depressed and anxious people when they came to the doctor to first try taking part in gardening programs. Turned out to be twice as effective as giving people drugs because it was dealing with their loneliness. When we understand what's really causing depression and anxiety, we can get to the real solutions. And that's what's so important. Your pain makes sense. We need to stop insulting that pain and start listening to it because it's telling us something we really need to hear.
I agree completely. Johann Hari, thank you so much. Great to see you tonight.
Cheers, Tucker. Thanks.
The central fact